1997 Wrestling Observer newsletter. Dennis Rodman hired by WCW after WWF negotiations. New Japan announces signing of Naoya Ogawa, tons more. By Observer staff. Dennis Rodman became the latest media star of the moment brought into pro wrestling as a publicity stunt in an announcement made by WCW over the weekend. Rodman, the regularly suspended current leading antihero of the NBA's Chicago Bulls, who has a movie coming out this week, will be part of the NWO group and appear on the WCW Uncensored pay-per-view show on March 16 in Charleston, South Carolina, and make what is believed to be 2 additional appearances with WCW as a participant in matches, the first of which is tentatively planned for the July 13 Bash at the Beach pay-per-view in Daytona Beach. WCW was able to outmaneuver the WWF, which was also pursuing Rodman. The WWF had offered Rodman a 2-show deal reportedly for a $1 million fee, the first of which would have been WrestleMania, to appear in Goldust's corner to attempt to help the faltering Goldust character get over stronger as both a babyface and as a mainstream bizarre cult figure. The second of which was the SummerSlam pay-per-view in August, where he and Goldust would have formed a tag team. However, Rodman's representatives, since Rodman worked a WCW pay-per-view in July of 1995 as Hulk Hogan's corner man for the Bash at the Beach in Huntington Beach, California, went to WCW to match the offer. WCW pulled the deal off for an undisclosed figure, although you'd have to figure they at least matched the WWF's offer if not topped it in some fashion, since there were several incentives for WCW to do so. Besides nixing a WWF publicity ploy with a star that would have gotten the mainstream play, WCW was able to get a front-page story in the Chicago Sun-Times just 2 weeks before WrestleMania with the breaking of the story, although WCW had for the most part completed the deal more than a week earlier. In the Chicago market, where Rodman has to be one of the 2 biggest sports celebrities right now behind only Michael Jordan, WCW stole much of WWF's local thunder as they built for WrestleMania, although Mania is going to sell out or come close to it anyway. Rodman, who has been a fan of Hogan's for years, taped a segment with Hogan that promoted both Rodman's movie that comes out this coming weekend and the Uncensored pay-per-view 2 days later, which aired toward the end of the March 10 Monday Nitro television show. Rodman's contract with the Chicago Bulls wouldn't prohibit him for passive participation in something like pro wrestling. He could be in the corner, but not get physically involved to any real degree, during the season. When the season ends, Rodman will be an unrestricted free agent, and thus without an NBA contract, would be free to perform in a pro wrestling match. WCW got some mainstream pub over the next few days, although not nearly as much as they pretended on the Nitro show. Most newspapers didn't carry the story, and aside from the Sun-Times, the few that did just ran a line or 2 in the AP Sports Rundown. It did get play, treated as a joke, on both the NBC and ABC radio network top-of-the-hour newscasts on Saturday morning. Perhaps the most play was Hogan and Rodman appearing on the Howard Stern show on March 10, with reports from the show saying Stern pretty much blew off Hogan's attempts to plug the WCW pay-per-view to concentrate on talking to Rodman. Apparently something on that show must have been said by Stern about Roddy Piper, since Piper lashed into Stern, among others, that evening on Nitro. It is expected over the next week that some of the entertainment television shows would carry this story. Actually, there was more mainstream press for the story in Japan, where Rodman appears on many television commercials. It was carried in prominent fashion in the sports pages, and on March 9, New Japan President Seiji Sakaguchi said that he'd like to have Rodman wrestle at one of the Dome shows this year in a tag team match with Scott Hall and or Kevin Nash, but thought that his price would be too high and gave the indication that he didn't believe there was a realistic chance of it happening. It's doubtful Rodman's appearance in Charleston, South Carolina in the corner will have any effect on the buy rate for the show, since Rodman already did a similar thing in Los Angeles, and it had no effect at that time. His match in July will probably garner a lot of mainstream press, and if he appears on Nitros frequently building up the event, he may cause a positive effect on television ratings similar to the Lawrence Taylor deal in the WWF, which spiked the Raw ratings for its duration but resulted in a disappointing buy rate on pay-per-view. It seems to be at this point that a major celebrity in wrestling causes a lot of talk and mainstream curiosity, which is good for ratings, but that those type of people aren't going to spend $27.95 to see someone on television in an activity still largely considered a joke that they are used to seeing regularly on television for free. However, the mainstream pub, whether the buy rate is strong for the July show or not, does get the name brand WCW over and buys the company great publicity. It's certainly a better investment in that regard than buying a bunch of race cars. New Japan Pro Wrestling officially announced at a press conference on March 7 that Naoya Ogawa, the 1992 Olympic silver medalist in judo in the 209-pound weight class, would replace Ken Shamrock as Shinya Hashimoto's opponent in the main event on the April 12 show at the Tokyo Dome. It was announced 2 days later that the match wouldn't be for Hashimoto's IWGP Heavyweight title because it would be under martial arts rules, no time limit, and must be a finish by either submission or knockout, with pinning not applicable to the match. Virtually all the sports pages in Japan on March 8 listed the Ogawa-Hashimoto announcement as that day's lead sports story on the front page, which was a level of publicity that a Hashimoto-Shamrock match wouldn't have been able to achieve. As of press time, only 2 other matches on that show have been announced: the Great Muta vs. Masahiro Chono and the J-Crown title defense of Jushin Liger vs. Great Sasuke. The feeling in Japan from just about everyone close to the situation is that this main event should draw a sellout, which, because of raised mid-level prices, would likely be the largest live gate in the history of Japanese pro wrestling. However, with the yen falling as compared to the dollar of late, the gate wouldn't in US dollars top the all-time record of $6.1 million for the Nobuhiko Takada vs. Keiji Muto first match. While Ogawa, 28, is not the name Shamrock is to pro wrestling fans in Japan, he is a far more famous name among the general public. In addition, he's a legitimate national sports legend since he won 3 world championships and 7 national championships in a sport invented and popularized in Japan. This will result in far more mainstream media publicity for the match, as a lot of media outlets that would shy away from coverage of a match involving a pro wrestler against an Ultimate Fight star would give coverage to the pro wrestling debut of a national legend in judo in a Tokyo Dome match against the IWGP champion. While Ogawa at the press conference hinted that he would be receiving 100 million yen, about $825,000, for the match, it's doubtful that figure is anything even close to resembling a legitimate number, as the figure Shamrock was offered for the same position on the same card, which would have sold out just as easily, wasn't anywhere close to that figure. When Ogawa made the decision to go into pro wrestling, apparently feeling he'd gone as far in judo as he could after finishing 5th in the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, he had first contacted Giant Baba and All Japan Pro Wrestling. Baba turned down Ogawa as he didn't want to offer a huge financial guarantee to someone unproven when it came to pro wrestling, since his company is essentially a work rate promotion almost devoid of gimmicks. In addition, a generation ago, Baba did a similar experiment and signed an Olympic gold medalist in judo, Anton Geesink of the Netherlands, to a huge money, at the time, deal and pushed him immediately to the top of the cards as the number 2 babyface in the company behind Baba himself. While the 6'8" Geesink's presence in pro wrestling drew a lot of publicity in the early 70s, he never got the knack of it, was a poor worker, and his career was over within a few years. But All Japan did get good short-term results at the gate and in casual interest from the 2 similar experiments in its history in Geesink and a retired sumo grand champion named Hiroshi Wajima in the 80s, who was also a flop in the ring that only lasted a few years but garnered a lot of early interest. However, New Japan jumped at the chance, since some of the biggest matches in the history of the company have involved bringing in outsiders from other sports, including former judo stars like Willem Ruska, Alan Coage, Bad News Allen, and Shota Chakayashvili, with ballyhooed mixed matches against Antonio Inoki. Paul Heyman has finalized a 7-match lineup for the April 13th ECW Barely Legal pay-per-view show. Most of the show has already been announced, but the complete lineup will be the Eliminators defending the ECW tag team titles against Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley, a singles match involving Chris Candido with an angle shot that night to determine his opponent, the Michinoku Pro Wrestling match with Great Sasuke and Grand Naniwa and Grand Hamada vs. Taka Michinoku and Terry Boy, men's Teo in Japan and Dick Togo, Shane Douglas defending the ECW TV title against Pitbull No. 2, Sabu vs. Taz, the Triangle match with Terry Funk, Stevie Richards and Sandman, and the Ultimate title match with Raven defending against the winner of the Triangle match to end the show. The pay-per-view show will air in the vast majority of request systems, and a few cable companies that carry viewers' choice that specifically asked for the show on a standalone basis. There were request systems, including Intermedia Partners, and some Cablevision systems, including on Long Island, that don't carry NHB events, that also chose not to carry this event because of the perceived violent nature. There have been numerous so-called third-party attempts on pay-per-view over the years within both pro wrestling and NHB genre, and some that sort of are a mix between the two, like Japanese so-called and real shoot wrestling. Most were unsuccessful at first. A few that showed life at the beginning were unable to sustain it. There has only been one legitimate success story. ECW is unique in that it is well established and has a more fervent cult base of fans than any third party that has attempted such an undertaking. It has more of a proven track record in regard to popularity when it comes to consistent attendance than most, but not all, that have tried, and ultimately failed previously. The only true success to this point besides WWF and WCW on pay-per-view is the UFC, which started in November of 1993 with a money-losing 0.35 buy rate, about 75,000 buys, and took off to the point that it was profitable on its third show. Unlike most groups that started during the same time period, its audience grew with repeated showings, peaking with the fifth and sixth shows. In 1995, its buy rates consistently topped both WWF and WCW, peaking with better than 1.0 buy rates, 260,000 buys, for superfights involving Hoist Gracie vs. Ken Shamrock and Shamrock vs. Dan Severn. However, its numbers declined from that point, with a noticeable decline to a new lower level of popularity over the spring and summer of 1996, settling it at doing consistent 0.4 to 0.5 buy rates, a level a little bit below what WWF and WCW are now doing. UFC was able to be a major force on pay-per-view, and still would be running profitable shows provided they weren't under governmental harassment, despite having no television to create stars and get over its storylines. What UFC has been successful in doing is getting lots of mainstream media publicity to where the UFC name is very well known as the brand name for an illusion of a style of fighting that many would say the events themselves really can't live up, or down, depending on your viewpoint to. UFC, and its main competitor, EFC, due to national media publicity and controversy, are a lot better known to the general public than ECW, as noted by the fact that ECW is often confused by people with being EFC, but almost never the latter. EFC had tons of mainstream pub for the first show, particularly in New York, over being moved out of New York in the days leading to the show. This is something it's doubtful ECW will get, and enabled the first show to pop an initial buy rate of 0.3, which was either break-even or perhaps a slight profit or loss, but the two subsequent shows have done money, losing ratings of less than 0.2, and the group is now in danger of closing up should this upcoming show not show some life. NHB and pro wrestling aren't the same in that there are far more fans of pro wrestling, but there are also two established major name brands in pro wrestling that already run monthly shows. Many would say there is already a glut of pay-per-view pro wrestling programming already out there. But pro wrestling is also undeniably the hottest it's been in many years right now. ECW has the television exposure, admittedly limited in scope, that the shoot groups don't have. TV exposure sells their stars and create people who are huge stars to, in this case, a somewhat limited amount of people. In addition, the ECW exposure on Monday Night Raw has created a new awareness outside of its cult audience for the name ECW, and it's the brand name and concept of ECW that the company is selling, and not any particular individual or match, which should add curiosity buys of people who would have otherwise never heard of the group. In a look at new groups that have attempted pay-per-view aside from WWF, WCW and UFC, which are the only ones to really make it big, we see the following. AWA World Class in Memphis, 1988, held Super Clash 3 from the UIC Pavilion in Chicago, headlined by a so-called world title unification match with Jerry Lawler vs. Kerry Von Erich. Although generally remembered as a flop, the show was overall decent with a good main event. The buy rate was 0.5, which would be a huge success today, but in those days was considered a flop as it amounted to about 40,000 buys, which would be break-even. The groups that were working together quickly fell apart and none ever ran a pay-per-view again, and all the groups suffered business declines in the wake of the show. This group has major exposure advantages over ECW in that all three promotions that were involved with the show had strong and in some cases very highly rated regional television, and NWA had a weekly show on ESPN that drew decent ratings. None of the groups had the cult following of ECW, but all had tons more television exposure, and all in those days were capable of drawing bigger crowds and had on the show wrestlers with far bigger national names than ECW does today. Herb Abrams UWF, 1991, ran Beach Brawl from Palmetto, Florida, headlined by Steve Williams vs. Bam Bam Bigelow. The show wasn't good, but it was a lot better than expected going in with a solid main event match. However, it totally stiffed on pay-per-view, doing about 5,000 buys. But it was well known going in that this group didn't have a prayer, and doing a pay-per-view was simply an ill-fated ego trip for the tragic eccentric promoter. LPWA, 1992, ran the Super Ladies Showdown in Rochester, Minnesota. Again, the wrestling quality of the show was better than expected, but with nobody on the show with a national name, or for that matter any kind of a name, and limited syndication, although probably more than ECW has at this point, it was a total stiff and the promotion folded shortly thereafter. UWFI was the first group to run on its own from Japan, 1993. This was backed by a tremendous advertising campaign which got over the slogan, "Shoot fighting, it's real," which it wasn't. But that's another story. The first show was a huge success, doing in 0.48 buy rate, which was about what WCW was doing for its pay-per-view shows at the time, and this was with no television exposure and nobody with name identity. so it shows a pay-per-view can draw based on a new concept getting over. However, lack of follow-up and the lack of punches to the face made it less appealing to Americans rooted in boxing as what a combat sport is supposed to look like, and the UFC that debuted 1 month later took off while this went nowhere, falling to about an 0.1 buy rate for the second show. After an excellent third show most notable for the debut of Jeff Blatnick as a color commentator, the group was done on pay-per-view. WCW had promoted 3 New Japan Super shows, which were Tokyo Dome tapes aired months later, of shows in 1991, 1992 and 1993. The first show did an 0.6 buy rate, which was below what the regular WCW shows were doing at the time, but considered a success for a novelty event that wasn't heavily promoted and only expected to draw from the limited hardcore wrestling fan audience. The promotion of the first show was much stronger than the second and third shows, which didn't do as well. WCW tried again in 1995 with Collision in Korea, a taped show of the 2 cards held in front of the 2 largest crowds in pro wrestling history at Mayday Stadium in Pyongyang, North Korea, doing less than an 0.2 buy rate. WCW also ran some unsuccessful K1 kickboxing shows from Japan on pay-per-view which also did less than 0.2 buy rates. World Combat Championship, 1995, a pay-per-view event from Charlotte, North Carolina was put on by Christopher Peters as basically the first offshoot of the successful by that point UFC. It had tremendous pre-show coverage in the martial arts magazines and was budgeted to do a first-class pay-per-view production. When it didn't hit, it was a huge money loser, possibly to the tune of 7 figures, doing less than a 0.2 buy rate, and was never heard from again. Continental Wrestling Alliance, 1996, ran 1 taped show from the Dallas Sportatorium, largely based around an ego trip of a prison guard named Dominic Minaldi, attempting to be a pro wrestler. Did anyone buy that show? How many of you even know it existed? Extreme Fighting, 1995, was the second UFC offshoot on pay-per-view. It garnered far more mainstream pub than WCC, largely overscheduling its initial shot in Brooklyn, which resulted in a decent buy rate. It was basically a lower budgeted version of UFC. That debut was considered a poor show, and the follow-up show near Montreal with all the Canadian governmental intervention and post-show arrests was a total calamity. The third show was a great card, but the buy rates for shows 2 and 3 were both in the 0.14 to 0.18 range, were major losers. The group has a 4th show coming up on March 28, which looks good on paper to martial arts hardcore fans, but realistically doesn't appear to have much of a shot at turning a profit, and the group has to be considered in critical condition. Pancrase, 1996, promoted by Semaphore Entertainment Group as an offshoot of UFC, ran 4 shows. There was virtually no hype or promotion to the events, which were the closest thing to a shoot sport as the world of pro wrestling has ever seen, and the style was virtually unrecognizable to American pro wrestling fans. However, it wasn't pushed as pro wrestling in the US, and instead pushed to the far more limited martial arts audience. The surprising draw of the first event, which did an 0.25 buy rate and 60,000 buys, may have been partially due to the $9.95 introductory price tag. The follow-up shows all did in the 0.1 range, although the final show, after the die had been cast, similar to the final UWFI show, was an excellent pay-per-view event. Martial Arts Reality Superfighting, 1996, spent literally 7 figures, particularly with a huge advertising budget, to promote a Gracie, albeit Renzo Gracie, versus Toktarov match. There were tons of TV commercial spots, which were well produced, bought on boxing and wrestling television shows, and the Gracie name is well known from Royce Gracie in UFC, and Toktarov has name recognition although no drawing power. This was probably the single biggest disaster ever on pay-per-view, with 7-figure losses on the show that sold about 100 tickets live and didn't even produce an 0.1 buy rate. Which brings us to the one promotion that ran on pay-per-view that may be the closest for comparison to ECW, the 1994 AAA When Worlds Collide pay-per-view. Both groups were basically similar in that they were introducing a new concept of pro wrestling in the US to pay-per-view, different to what WWF and WCW were providing, that was originally popularized in foreign countries, ECW basically being an American derivative of Japan's FMW. Both had loyal fan bases but virtually no mainstream or crossover recognition when the shows were announced. ECW has gotten a few weeks of first-rate hype on WWF television. AAA got a few weeks of hype on WCW television, although nowhere close to the same degree, even though WCW actually was involved as promoters of the pay-per-view portion of the show. Both cards on paper looked to be very good going in. The AAA show, in fact, was arguably one of the greatest pay-per-view wrestling events in history. If the ECW event is anywhere close to that level, it'll be looked on as a huge success, at least from that standpoint. If you compare AAA of late 1994 with ECW of early 1997, this is what you see. Both have little national recognition going in, but both had tremendous cult followings. AAA in Los Angeles was far more popular than ECW is anywhere. In fact, except for WWF in the major markets during its peak, you'd be hard-pressed to find any American promotion that enjoyed the popularity run AAA did in Los Angeles over that 18-month period. And actually they drew more in places like Chicago, San Jose and New York than ECW has ever done anywhere in its history, so you're talking the 4 of the 5 biggest markets in the country having a real documented strong and rabid following. Of course, being a Mexican group, the following was heavily regionalized and almost exclusively ethnic with basically no crossover appeal. ECW's following is heavily regionalized based on lack of television exposure. The AAA When Worlds Collide pay-per-view show in late 1994, co-promoted by WCW, did in 0.24 buy rate, or about 44,000 buys, which was about break-even. Since AAA didn't have the negative of viewers' choice not carrying the event and not airing in Canada, it was available in far more homes than ECW. By all rights, with the AAA of 1994 having bigger stars with more name value, at least to its cult audience, don't kid yourself, every Mexican-American at the time knew Santo, Pero Arguello, Octagon, etc. And if you walk down the street and ask, nobody except hardcore wrestling fans know Sabu and Taz, and even most average wrestling fans would be hard-pressed to recognize any ECW name except Terry Funk, and perhaps Shane Douglas. With more television exposure, and with a far more popular promotion and with wider distribution, ECW shouldn't be expected to do anywhere close to that figures, right? Maybe yes. Maybe no. The difference is ECW's main strength. AAA had progressive wrestling and a hot promotion at the time, although it had already cooled in the US from its peak 1 year earlier due to changes on Galavision cable, which went from 7 hours per week of AAA programming to about 1 hour, which actually as much as anything else was why AAA fell so fast in popularity in the US, because the exposure simply was no longer there, and exposure is the lifeblood of pro wrestling. But even at its best, AAA was totally messed up in regards to promotion, timing, deadlines, etc. It had no idea how to build or promote a pay-per-view. It did nothing to peak angles for the pay-per-view. As good as people remember that pay-per-view show being, it was really no better, although the one tag team match was exceptional, than most of their major arena shows during that time period, nor did it come across to the promotion's fans as any bigger of a deal, since the Los Angeles live crowd was only average for AAA in that market during that time period. AAA failed to capitalize on the aesthetic success of its first show and failed to follow up to the casual fans who may have bought the show for curiosity reasons stemming from WCW television promotion, and AAA quickly faded from those fans' memories, and there was never a second show. When it comes to hyping the importance of the show and peaking angles, there is no comparison. To the ECW audience, this is a big deal. The angles are peaking perfectly. The storylines have been geared in this direction, in some cases for more than 1 year. Unlike WCW, which failed to feature or put over any AAA talent on its television before the event, ECW has had its performers featured on WWF television with some strong angles, and those segments have made real mainstream impact, something AAA failed to accomplish since it was given no chance to accomplish it in hyping its pay-per-view event. Even though WCW had a financial interest in the AAA show, there was so much of the expected interpromotional jealousy and lack of communication that kept the hype level to a bare minimum, with WCW not wanting to do anything to take interest away from its own pay-per-view event at the same time. It's been exactly the opposite with the WWF/ECW connection. In addition, ECW already has plans for tentative dates for both a second and third show and ideas of where they are going, something AAA didn't have, and when its first show was successful, everyone was scrambling about a second show, deadlines fell through, WCW really didn't care, and the second show never took place. So how will the ECW pay-per-view do? Realistically, they may make more profit from merchandising the event after the fact with videotape and t-shirt sales than from the event itself. With the ticket prices to the live show jacked up and revenue coming in from the Terry Funk banquet, as a singular weekend of events, the losses, if there are any, shouldn't put the company in a dangerous predicament or spell major troubles, as has been the case with other companies that have banked their future and then faded away after failing on pay-per-view. Even if there are profits, it's not like anyone at ECW will see them for 90 to 120 days. The pay-per-view is a cog in the wheel to build up future arena business, as with the pre-show business nowadays, is being built to be the hottest period ever for the company. Financially, the show may prove to be a success for the company, almost like a pyramid standing on its head, with the pay-per-view itself being the loss leader rather than almost the opposite for other companies that have presented events on pay-per-view, where the events needed to be successful on a standalone basis and was the make or break for company profitability. Of course, ECW is also the most unique perception promotion in the world. There are people ready to trumpet a failure on pay-per-view into a success, and people ready and waiting for a failure to prove what they've believed all along. The ECW pay-per-view story is far more interesting because so many more people are interested in how it does than all of the aforementioned companies that have tried and mostly failed over the past 9 years, rather than how many people actually buy the show as compared with all those different groups. For whatever reason, drawing 1,100 to 1,500 every 3 weeks in a city the size of Philadelphia is considered an overwhelming success because they pack a tiny bingo hall, despite those being what would be considered tepid attendance figures for any promotion of any real popularity in a city of that size if it was anyone but ECW. It does have to be noted the crowd is consistent and loyal beyond belief in that it never falls below a certain figure, but it's not like there have ever been 5,000 people on any night wanting to get in. And it's not like angles have never peaked before for in a manner that would be expected for a good promotion to draw a monster house with let alone close to 26,000, jammed traffic for miles, and came to the sports arena the night AAA ran its debut show in the building. ECW is able to sell out small halls in the Northeast, largely because they book small halls and rarely book buildings of any size. I can recall when AAA ran a show in Oakland, California, a city that is largely black with very few Mexicans and with no television exposure in the city whatsoever. They drew 1,300 fans, and it was considered a colossal failure, and it was. If WWF this year were to run a house show that draws 1,300 fans, it would be considered a failure, and it would probably be one of the worst houses of the year. A 1,300-person house would be a bad house for any of the 3 different promotions that run Tijuana, a city of hardly the same population as Philadelphia. A WCW show drawing that kind of figure would be a failure. That same show would be considered by many as a great house if it was an ECW show in New York City, the largest metro area in the country. Jim Cornette remarked that ECW is a few people who make 95% of the noise, and he's probably right in that line of thinking. But if those few people spend enough money on things like videotapes and t-shirts along with tickets so ECW can draw a profit, it doesn't matter if millions don't casually tune in on Monday night that would never even consider spending a nickel on pro wrestling. It may mean something for bragging rights on Tuesdays, but mean almost nothing for the company's bottom line. And if those few people make enough noise that WWF and WCW are fooled into thinking there are more than a few people and they can be a beneficial ally in a ratings war, they can turn ECW and that few into a real story and ultimately a reality of many, which may actually be the most real ECW story. But can those few people through that same illusion convince enough people to buy a pay-per-view show? No. That's why the WWF exposure may have been the event's saving grace. And maybe that's the real story of the pay-per-view. On April 13th, a major question is answered and we find out if the popularity of ECW at this particular moment is illusion created by a few making a lot of noise or a significant reality created by a few angles on Monday Night Raw. So we'll find out how few or how many is a few in a few weeks. Results. February 22nd, Ponce, Puerto Rico, WWC, Farmer Sam at Atletico B. Rico Suave and El Convicto 308, Jim Steele B. Ray Gonzalez, WWC Tag Titles, Texas Hangman B. La Ley and Ricky Santana DQ, Invader No. 1 and Chicky Star B. Huracan Castillo Jr. and Abdullah the Butcher DQ, Universal Title Nene B. Carlos Colon to win title. February 24th, Oberhausen, Germany, WWF, 4193, Aldo Montoya b. Alex Porto, Sultan b. Flash Funk, Doug Furnace and Phil La Fawn b. Bob Holly and Leif Cassidy, Ahmed Johnson b. Owen Hart, Bret Hart b. Mankind, IC title, Rocky Maivia b. Billy Gunn, Davey Boy Smith b. Vader, WWF title Sid b. Hunter Hearst Helmsley. February 28th, New Orleans, Louisiana, WWF, 4210, Headbanger Mosh b. Barry Horowitz, Jake Roberts b. Goon, Barney Bill Irwin, Godwins b. Blackjacks DQ, Crush b. Bart Gunn, Headbanger Thrasher b. Freddie Joe Floyd, Arm Wrestling, Marlena b. Sonny, Goldust b. Savio Vega, Cage Match Undertaker b. Farouk. February 28th, Mexico City, Promo Azteca, Dragon Cheeto de Oro and Mini Electra b. Mini Payasos, Torero and Sky b. Colt and Aspid, Andy Barrow and Rocky Santana and Jurassico b. Vaquero Romo and Tarzan Boy and Antifaz del Norte, Angel Azteca b. Tiburon, Black Dragon b. Ultimo Rebelde, Pantera del Ring b. Ultimo Guerrero, Psicosis b. Super Colo Azteca d. Black Dragon, Pantera del Ring B Psicosis, Pirata Morgan and Blue Panther and Mascara Año 2000 B Lizmark Jr. and Zorro and La Parka DQ. March 1st Alexandria, Louisiana WWF, 2390 Headbanger Mosh B Barry Horowitz, Jake Roberts B Goon, Godwins B Blackjacks DQ Crush B Bart Gunn, Headbanger Thrasher B Freddie Joe Floyd, Arm Wrestling, Marlena B Sunny, Goldust B Savio Vega, Cage Match Undertaker B Farouk. March 3rd Oi Hashiman, Michinoku Pro 280, Hanzo Nakajima B Yoshito Sugimoto, Wellington Wilkins Jr. B Now Hiro Hoshikawa, Masayoshi Motegi and Shiryu B Super Delphin and Masato Yakashiji, Jinsei Shinzaki B Shoichi Funaki, Great Sasuke and Grand Hamada and Grand Naniwa B Taka Michinoku and Dick Togo and Men's Teo. March 3rd Oriyama, All Japan Women, Rumi Sekiguchi B Miyuki Fuji, Nani Takahashi B Miho Wakizawa, Yoshiko Tamura B Yukashina, Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Makawa and Momoe Nakanishi B Kaoru Ito and Yumi Fukawa and Genki Misae, Tashio Yamada B Saya Endo Takako Inoue and Mariko Yoshida B Manami Toyota and Ri Tamada. March 3rd Yamaguchi, JWP, Plum Marco B Sari Azumi, Kanako Matoya B Rieko Amano, Mayumi Ozaki B Tomoko Miyaguchi, Devil Masami and Tomoko Kuzumi B Hiromi Yagi and Hikari Fukuoka, Yagi and Kenny Akutsu and Cutie Suzuki and Fukuoka B Kuzumi and Mariko and Boyshoi Kid and Dynamite Kansai. March 3rd Greenville, South Carolina, Southern Championship Wrestling, 130, Shane Austin B Kid Dynamite, Max Miles B El Toro, Freedom Fighter and Denny Cooley B Big Daddy Kane and Sweet Dreams, Johnny Dollar B Jake Mulligan DQ, Stray Cats B Ricky Regal and Iceman, Mike Murphy, Jimmy Valiant and Desperado DDQ Nightmare and JJ Justice. March 4th Rome, Georgia WCW Saturday Night and Main Event Tapings, 2,500 with 2,000 paid, Jim Duggan B David Taylor, Roadblock B Larry Santo, S-Train B Buddy Lee Parker WCW TV title, Prince Aokia B Super Kalo, Glacier B JL, Harlem Heat B Jim Powers and Bobby Walker, Diamond Dallas Page B Billy Kidman, Kevin Sullivan B Tim Cheeks, Public Enemy B La Parka and Galaxy, Lex Luger B Max, Eddie Guerrero B Craig Pittman, High Voltage B Kidman and Chavo Guerrero Jr., Chris Jericho B Mark Starr, Bobby Eaton B Dean Malenko DQ, WCW TV title Aokia B Juventud Guerrera, Jeff Jarrett B JL, Hugh Morris B Villano 4, Conan B Tony Carr, Public Enemy B Bunkhouse Buck and Mike Enos, Harlem Heat B Renegade and Joe Gomez DQ, Conan and Parka and Villano 4 B Guerrera and Galaxy and Chavo Guerrero Jr., Mike Whitney B Hardbody Harrison, Jericho B Pat Tanaka, Renegade and Gomez B Santo and Star, Roadblock B Rick Fuller. March 4th Ishikawa, Michinoku Pro 2000 Sellout, Wellington Wilkins Jr. B Yoshito Sugimoto, Masayoshi Motegi B Now Hiro Hoshikawa, Super Delphin and Grand Naniwa B Shoichi Funaki and Hanzo Nakajima, Jinsei Shinzaki B Shiryu, Dick Togo and Men's Teo and Taka Michinoku B Great Sasuke and Grand Hamada and Masato Yakashiji. March 4th Tokyo Korakuen Hall, IWA, 250, Kishin Kawabata B Takeshi Sato Mima Shimoda B Emi Motokawa, Metal Face and Katsumi Hirano B Crusher Takahashi and Keizo Matsuda and Daiko Kubo Benkei B Shun Matsuzaki and Takashi Ishikawa, Masao Orihara and Keisuke Yamada and Great Kabuki B Gedo and Jado and Hiromichi Fuyuki. March 5th Niigata, New Japan 4000 Sellout, Black Cat B Kazuyuki Fujita, Kunyaki Kobayashi B Norio Oniga, Akitoshi Saito and Akira Nagami B Yutaka Yoshi and Osamu Nishimura, El Samurai and Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit, and Jushin Liger B Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto, Meng and Barbarian and Steven Regal B Shinya Hashimoto and Junji Hirata and Tadao Yasuda, Riki Chashu and Osamu Kido and Kazuo Yamazaki B Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara, Tatsumi Fujinami, and Kengo Kimura B Kensuke Sasaki and Takashi Iizuka, Masahiro Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito B Keiji Muto and Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi. March 5th Tokushima, Michinoku Pro, 888, Wellington Wilkins Jr. B Yoshito Sugimoto, Masayoshi Motegi B Shiryu, Jinsei Shinzaki B Grand Naniwa, Shinzaki B Naniwa, Dick Togo and Men's Teo and Taka Michinoku and Shoichi Funaki and Hanzo Nakajima B Great Sasuke and Grand Hamada and Super Delphin and Nao Hiro Hoshikawa and Naniwa. March 5th Imabari, All Japan Women, Nani Takahashi B Rumi Sekiguchi, Momoe Nakanishi B Miho Wakizawa, Genki Misae B Yukashina, Toshio Yamada and Ri Tamada and Yoshiko Tamura beat Takako Inoue and Yumi Fukawa and Kaoru Ito, Kumiko Makawa beat Saya Endo, Kyoko Inoue and Tomoko Watanabe beat Manami Toyota and Mariko Yoshida. March 5, Nashville, Tennessee, North American All-Star Wrestling Scufflin' Hillbilly beat Charlie Parker, Chad Casey beat Billy Briggs, Fair and Square beat Shane Morton, Justin St. John beat Kip Morris, Doug Gilbert and Tommy Rich beat Wild Boys, Debbie Combs beat Candy Divine, Colorado Kid Tracy Smothers. March 6, Kawagoe, New Japan, 2000, Kazuyuki Fujita beat Yutaka Yoshi, Samu Kido beat Black Cat, Wild Pegasus beat Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Jushin Liger and El Samurai beat Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto, Manabu Nakanishi and Osamu Nishimura and Satoshi Kojima beat Akitoshi Saito and Akira Nagami and Kunyaki Kobayashi, Mang and Barbarian and Steven Regal beat Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Masahiro Chono, Shinya Hashimoto and Junji Hirata beat Kazuo Yamazaki and Takashi Iizuka, Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsutoshi Goto and Michiyoshi Ohara beat Keiji Muto and Kensuke Sasaki and Tadao Yasuda. March 6, Tokyo, LLPW 260, Emi Motokawa beat Keiko Aono, Carol Midori beat Miho Watabe, Yasha Kurenai and Mikiko Futagami beat Harley Saito and Mizuki Endo, Michiko Omukai and Inorio Tadano and Rumi Kazama beat Shark Tsuchiya and Michiko Nagashima and Sori Okino, LLPW title Eagle Sawai beat Shinobu Kondori. March 7, Buffalo, New York, WWF, 8338, Crush beat Bob Holly, Savio Vega beat Bart Gunn, IC title, Rocky Maivia beat Sultan, Ahmed Johnson beat Vega, WWF tag titles, Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith beat Doug Furnas and Phil Lawson, Farouk beat Undertaker DQ, Goldust beat Mankind, cage match for WWF titles Sid beat Bret Hart. March 7, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, New Japan, 1758 sellout, Black Cat beat Yutaka Yoshi, Akitoshi Saito beat Kazuyuki Fujita, Tadao Yasuda and Osamu Nishimura beat Kunyaki Kobayashi and Tatsutoshi Goto, El Samurai and Wild Pegasus and Jushin Liger beat Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto, Mang and Barbarian and Steven Regal beat Manabu Nakanishi and Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki, Keiji Muto and Satoshi Kojima beat Kazuo Yamazaki and Takashi Iizuka, Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Masahiro Chono beat Shiro Koshinaka and Michiyoshi Ohara and Akira Nagami. March 7, Tijuana, Norte, California, AAA, 5,500 sellout, Metallica beat Damas Violencia, Shamu 2 and Hijo de la Muerte and Angel beat Commando Jr. and Bola de Humo and Sueño Chicano and Astucia beat Colibri and Furestar, Firebird and Magico and Fantomas beat Medico Asesino Jr. and El Hijo del Enfermero and Caligula, Pantera and Leon Negro and Supernova beat Hysteria and Espectro and Depredator 3 and 1/2 stars, Mexican middleweight title Octagon beat Fuerza Guerrera 3 stars, Cibernetico and Connect beat Razor Ramon and Diesel DQ 3 1/4 stars. March 7, Komatsujima, All Japan Women, Miho Wakizawa beat Rumi Sekiguchi, Nani Takahashi beat Yuka Shina, Sai Endo beat Momoe Nakanishi, Takako Inoue and Mariko Yoshida and Yumi Fukawa beat Kyoko Inoue and Toshio Yamada and Genki Misae, Kaoru Ito beat Yoshiko Tamura, Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Makawa beat Manami Toyota and Ri Tamada. March 7, North Versailles, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Big Daddy Adams and Black Cat beat Bone Crusher and Quinn Magnum, Scotty Blaze beat Sting Do, Giant Hillbillies beat Adonis and JT Nightmare, Paul Atlas beat Mad Mike, Salvatore Sincere beat Brian Anthony, Dennis Gregory beat Corporal Punishment, Stevie Richards and Blue Meanie and JB Destiny and Colonel Payne beat Frank Stiletto and Lou Marconi and Adam Flash and Axel Rotten. March 8, Cleveland, Ohio Aft. Show, WWF, 6,585, Crush beat Bob Holly, Savio Vega beat Bart Gunn, Hunter Hearst Helmsley beat Flash Funk, IC title, Rocky Maivia beat Sultan, Goldust beat Mankind, WWF tag titles, Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith beat Doug Furnas and Phil Lawson, Vader beat Ahmed Johnson, Farouk beat Undertaker DQ, cage match for WWF titles Sid beat Bret Hart. March 8, Detroit Cobo Arena, WWF, 9,565, Rick James beat Brooklyn Brawler, Steve Lombardi, Crush beat Bob Holly, Savio Vega beat Bart Gunn, IC title, Rocky Maivia beat Sultan, Hunter Hearst Helmsley beat Flash Funk, Vader beat Ahmed Johnson, WWF tag titles, Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith beat Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon, Goldust beat Mankind, Farouk beat Undertaker DQ, cage match for WWF titles Sid beat Bret Hart. March 8, Tokuyama, New Japan, 4,000 sellout, Yutaka Yoshi beat Kazuyuki Fujita, El Samurai B Norio Oniga, Wild Pegasus and Jushin Liger B Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani, Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi B Akitoshi Saito and Tatsutoshi Goto, Osamu Nishimura and Osamu Kido and Kengo Kimura and Tatsumi Fujinami B Shiro Koshinaka and Kuniaki Kobayashi and Akira Nagami and Michiyoshi Ohara, Keiji Muto B Steven Regal, Masahiro Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito B Takashi Iizuka and Kazuo Yamazaki and Riki Chashu, Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki B Faces of Fear. March 8, Trenton, New Jersey, ECW 1300 Sellout, Taz B Spike Dudley, ECW Tag Titles, Eliminators B Bad Crew, ECW Title Raven B Supernova, Pitbull No. 2 NC Brian Lee, Chris Chetty B Little Guido, Tommy Dreamer B D Von Dudley, New Jack and Louis Spicoli B Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney, Sandman B Bubba Ray Dudley, Sabu B Chris Condito. March 8, Washington, North Carolina, All-Star Wrestling, 1310, Mike Youngblood B David Jericho, David Cash, Firebreaker Chip, Curtis Thompson, B Poison Ivy, James Ivy, The Eagle, Jackie Fulton aka George Hines, DDQ Giant Kimala 2, Benjamin Peacock, Greg Valentine B Gorgeous George 3, Rob Kellum, Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson B Rex King and Bobby Fulton, Rob Van Dam B Billy Kidman. March 8, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, LLPW 1400, Soriokino B Miho Watabe, Miss Mongol B Keiko Aono, Mikiko Futagami B Emi Motokawa, Mizuki Endo and Rumi Kazama B Carol Midori and Yasha Kuranai, 3 of 5 Falls Eagle Sawai and Shark Tsuchiya and Michiko Nagashima and Linus Ashika B Shinobu Kondori, and Harley Saito and Norio Tadano and Michiko Omukai. March 8, Miyatsuzaka, All Japan Women, Yuka Shinobi Miyuki Fuji, Nani Takahashi B Miho Wakezawa, Genki Misae B Yumi Fukawa, Kyoko Inoue and Tomoko Watanabe and Momoe Nakanishi B Tashio Yamada and Saya Endo and Yoshiko Tamura, Minami Toyota B Kumiko Makawa, Takako Inoue and Mariko Yoshida B Kaoru Ito, and Ri Tamada. March 8, Paulsboro, New Jersey, NWA, Billy Real B Mantis, American Kickboxer B Tarek the Great, Patch B Stud, John Rambo B Ray Odyssey DQ, NWA title, Dan Severn B Harley Lewis, Twiggy Ramirez and Psychotron B Lost Boys, Maverick B Lumpy Little, Inferno Kid B Ace Darling and Steve Corino in Triangle Match, Barbed Wire Baseball Bat Match Derek Domino B Ian Rotten. March 8, Tijuana, Norte, California, Indiana, 220, Rocky Boy B Galaxy Jr., Bolida Umo and Black Silver B Shemu 2 and Cyclope, Thunderbird and Sagrado B Halloween and Pinheiro 3, Kiss and Charisma B Bronx Bomber and Leopardo Negro. March 8, Cupertino, California, All Pro Wrestling, 160, Tony Jones 1 Battle Royal, Jones B Boom Boom Kamini, Aaron O'Grady B Chris Cole, Manny Fernandez Original B Robert Thompson, Donovan Morgan B Vic Grimes DQ, Jason Clay B Mike Diamond Core, Cowboy Lang and Frank Dalton B Lil Nasty Boy and Steve Rizzono. March 8, Concord, NC, Carolina Championship Wrestling, 155, David Osborne B Willie Clay Jr., Thunder Tiger and Kevin Kirby B Spoiler and Juicer, Baby Huey and Equalizer B Tyrone Knox and Outlaw, Colt Steel B Scotty Piper, L.A. Stevens B Panther, Cannon and One Man Posse B Will Shooter and Tim Jackson, David Isley and Big Cheese Sal Corrente B Cruel Connection, Rising Suns, Speedy Gonzalez and Rick Slagle, B Mad Max and Willie Clay Sr., Thunderfoot, Gene Ligon, B Ricky Nelson. March 9th, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, JWP, 2010 Sellout, Candy Akutsu B Sari Azumi, Cutie Suzuki and Kanako Motoya B Tomoko Miyaguchi and Hikari Fukuoka, Mayumi Ozaki and Rieko Amano B Plum Mariko and Boyshoi Kid, JWP Junior title Tomoko Kuzumi B Hiromi Yagi, Devil Masami and Fukuoka and Akutsu and Miyaguchi B Dynamite Kansai and Suzuki and Mariko and Matoya. March 9th, Kawagoe, All Japan Women Momoe Nakanishi B Miyuki Fuji, Nani Takahashi B Rumi Sekiguchi, Miho Wakezawa and Atsuko Mitabi Yukishina and Tanny Mouse, Kumiko Makawa and Yoshiko Tamura B Yumi Fukawa and Yumiko Hata, Mima Shimoda B Ri Tamada, Genki Misae and Kaoru Ito and Manami Toyota B Takako Inoue and Mariko Yoshida and Saya Endo. March 10th, Panama City, Florida, WCW Nitro Tapings, 2000 Sellout, Jeff Jarrett and Steve McMichael B High Voltage, WCW TV title, Prince Aokia B David Taylor, U.S. title Eddie Guerrero B Jim Powers, Diamond Dallas Page B Craig Pittman, Rey Mysterio Jr. B Galaxy, Lex Luger and the Giant and Steiners B Amazing French Canadians and Greg Valentine and Roadblock, Ultimo Dragon B Juventud Guerrera, Scotty Riggs B Chris Jericho DQ, Kevin Sullivan Ter Hardbody Harrison. March 10, Worcester, Massachusetts, WWF Monday Night Raw tapings, 7481, Rocky Maivia B Tony Roy, Pentagon and Heavy Metal and Pierre Roth Jr. B Latin Lover and Hector Garza and Octagon 3¼ stars, Ahmed Johnson B Roy Raymond, Blackjacks B Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith DQ 3/1 star, Miguel Perez B Leif Cassidy, Billy Gunn B Aldo Montoya, Bulldust B Tim McNeely, Mankind and Vader B Undertaker and Sid 1 star. Special thanks to Scott Hudson, Eddie Goldman, Marco Gerton, Manuel Gonzalez, Paul Verlander, Faye Ferguson, Carl Nitz, Georgianne Macropolis, Marcus Watkins, Dan Paris, Ron Rivera, Greg Price, Sven Lutkin, Hernan Villarreal, Jesse Money. Japanese television rundown. February 9, All Japan. 1. Jun Akiyama pinned Akira Tao in 4:49 with the Exploder suplex. This was memorable for being such a major upset, being Akiyama's first career pin win in a singles match of a wrestler of the Tao level. They slapped each other around hard and had some good sequences, but it was too short and didn't build to much. 1¼ stars. 2. Steve Williams and Johnny Ace and the Eagle beat Masao Inoue and Tomohiro Honda and Toshiaki Kawada. Match went 21-31, about half of which aired on television. Surprisingly good, particularly when Kawada was in with Williams. Williams looked a lot better here than he's looked of late, with Williams eventually using the half crab for a submission on Honda after a lot of great near falls and saves. 3¾ stars. 3. Kawada and Masafuchi beat Yoshiaki Fujiwara and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi in 12:24. This was Fujiwara's first time ever in the ring against Kawada, but they didn't do much and there wasn't even much heat for it. A disappointment. 1¼ stars. February 22, New Japan. 1. Scott Norton and Chono and Tenzan beat Muto and Sasaki and Kojima in 12:02. A fast-paced good match. Chono used some chair shots on Muto and Muto ended up with some small cuts around his face. It wound up in a 3-on-2 after Tenzan eliminated Kojima using a mountain bomb and tombstone piledriver on the ramp. There was some sloppiness in spots but it was super stiff and really heated with good near falls before Norton finally pinned Sasaki after a powerbomb. 3½ stars. 2. Kanemoto beat Taka Michinoku to earn a shot at the J-Crown title in 14:41. Excellent match. About half the match aired on television. Michinoku had one of the most spectacular moves I've ever seen, basically from the ring turning in midair into a springboard moonsault over the guardrail onto Kanemoto. Lots of big moves and near falls ending when Kanemoto got the pin with a tiger suplex. 4 stars. 3. Liger pinned Otani in 27:14 to retain the J-Crown. About 13 minutes aired on television and based on that segment this looked match of the year level. Liger hit a plancha and followed it up with a power bomb on the floor. Otani came back and power bombed Liger on the floor. Neither sold the move as long as they could and should have. Otani did a tope con hilo that the cameras missed and then missed his springboard dropkick into the ring. Liger did a la magistral but Otani kicked out. Liger did a Frankensteiner off the top but Otani turned it into a cradle for a near fall. Liger did a German suplex but Otani wound up landing on his feet and coming back with a reverse kick and hit his own German suplex. The two continued to get near falls on each other using all their hot moves including Otani hitting the springboard drop kick, known as his swan dive. Liger doing a running Liger bomb, Otani with a German suplex and a dragon suplex. Liger with a palm blow and a pair of Frankensteiners. Otani set Liger up for a Frankensteiner off the top but Liger knocked him off the ropes 3 times. On the 4th climb, Otani began headbutting Liger like crazy before pulling the move off, and then got a great near fall with his swan dive. It wound up with Liger coming back and just slapping the hell out of Otani and using a palm blow that Otani sold huge for the pin. This was a clear step above the Owen Hart vs. Davey Boy Smith match and really the only match I've seen this year in its class is the Masao Kobashi singles. This was also the best 1-hour television wrestling show of the year. 4¾ stars. March 1, New Japan. 1. Kojima and Nakanishi beat Muto and Hirata in 15:49. About 6:30 aired on television and it was a great match. This was mainly to establish Kojima and Nakanishi as legit contenders for the IWGP Tag Team title since Muto and Hirata just had a title shot. Muto really did a great job here carrying the match. Finish saw then sandwich lariat Muto, then the two nailed Hirata with lariat after lariat including a sandwich lariat and finally Kojima got the spin with a lariat. Stiff as hell. 3¾ stars. 2. Norton and Chono and Tenzan beat Hashimoto and Sasaki and Yasuda in 12:59. About 5:30 aired and it was a good match largely due to Hashimoto. Bagwell and Hiro Saito were both at ringside for the match and interfered. Finish saw Tenzan come off the top with a headbutt on Yasuda and Chono use the SDF for the submission. After the match, Bagwell used a buff blockbuster on Otani. Yamazaki then did a run-in and did a stare down with the NWO which looked to be the beginning of a new angle. He then tore off his shirt and threw it at Hashimoto since this was an angle building to their IWGP title match that airs on the March 8th television show. 2.5 stars. 3. Great Muta pinned Koshinaka in 12:43. About half the match aired on television. It had a lack of heat because Muta did his slow-paced style. There is a huge difference in the work between Muto and Muta and it's pretty much accepted in that Muta does mainly gimmick work and Muto is a serious wrestler. That means Muta matches are never all that good. This was Koshinaka's first match back after being out of action since the end of September for major knee reconstructive surgery. Muta blue-green missed for a near fall. Koshinaka brought a table into the ring and went for a power bomb but Muta turned it into a Hurricane Rana. Muta used a Frankensteiner off the top rope and Koshinaka took the bump on the table and then Muta finished it up with a moonsault. After the match the NWO came out and Chono took off his shirt and tried to give it to Muta to join. Muta just walked out. The NWO then attacked Koshinaka until he was saved by his Heisei Ishingun teammates. 2.5 stars. 4. Liger pinned Kanemoto in 1926 to retain the J Crown. Yet another match of the year candidate. I'd have to rate the Otani match as slightly better but both were pretty much the same caliber. Move after move with awesome heat and psychology. Probably superior psychology-wise to the match the previous week. As with the Otani match, the only negative is that the guys didn't sell the apparently killer moves long enough. The key spot in that way here was Liger giving Kanemoto a brainbuster on the floor and getting in the ring. When Kanemoto got back in, which was fairly quickly, Liger charged at him and Kanemoto immediately threw him in an over-the-head belly-to-belly and then came off the top with his rolling senton for a near fall rather than selling what should have been a blow that knocked him out for minutes. Liger used a super fisherman buster for a great near fall and the place went nuts at the kickout. Liger followed it up with a Frankensteiner off the top, a released German suplex and La Magistral. Kanemoto came back with near falls from Liger bomb, tiger suplex and moonsault. He missed the second moonsault and began selling his right knee. Liger hit a palm blow and a running Liger bomb but Kanemoto still kicked out. Liger then hit 3 more palm blows, the final one a running blow into the corner, and finally scored the pin with a brainbuster off the top rope. After the match backstage, Masayoshi Motegi of the Wrestle Dream Factory promotion challenged Liger and the two ended up slapping each other in the face before Liger walked away. 4 3/4 stars. Puerto Rico. A correction from last week. The match where El Nene won the Universal title from Carlos Colon was on February 22nd in Ponce, not February 15th in Caguas as listed here last week. The result of the February 15th Caguas match was Colon winning by an outside interference DQ. Anyway, this all built to a major show on March 9th in Humacao with Nene vs. Colon for the title in a no DQ match and with the loser leaving town for 1 year. The other top matches on the show are Chicky Star vs. Abdullah the Butcher. Butcher holds Caribbean title but this is a non-title match. Invader number 1 vs. Huracan Castillo and Ray Gonzalez defending the Puerto Rican title against Jim Steele. New to WWC are Soulman Alex G and Ram Man, Johnny Evans, who are longtime Florida indie workers. EMLL This group and Promo Azteca ran a joint show on March 5th in Aguascalientes which drew about 10,000 fans with Felino and Black Warrior and Juventud Guerrera vs. Rey Mysterio Jr. and Shocker and Lizmark Jr. as the main event. Apparently the March 21st show at Arena Mexico is going to be one of the major shows of the year. They are putting together some sort of a spectacular which I believe is a celebration of the birth of Salvador Lederoth, who was the founder of this promotion. His nephew is Paco Alonso, who currently runs the show, and the major wrestling promoter in Mexico from the 1930s until his death. From what I gather, Lederoth was born in late March of 1897, so that weekend would be the 100th anniversary of his birth. There will also be a major show in June for the Antonio Inoki World Wrestling Peace Festival. Don't have a report on the Arena Mexico from March 7th other than the headline was Dr. Wagner Jr. and Silver King and Bestia Salvaje vs. Negro Casas and Black Magic and La Fiera. Black Warrior retained the NWA Light Heavyweight title beating Atlantis on March 4th at Arena Coliseo. Promo Azteca. Pantera del Ring won the first Azteca Middleweight Championship beating Angel Azteca in the tournament final on March 7th in Toluca. The first 2 rounds of the tournament on February 28th in Mexico City aired on television over the weekend. All the matches were said to have been good, with the best one being Psicosis pinning Super Calo. Psicosis ended up losing to Pantera del Ring in the second round. The next Tijuana show is March 21st with Mysterio Jr. and La Parka vs. Misterioso and Blue Panther. Villanos 4 and 5 defend the WWA Tag Team titles against Brazo de Oro and Brazo de Plata, Damien and Halloween and Phobia vs. Pandilleros and Mascarada Sagrada, and Ultimo Dragonchito vs. Jurito Estrada and Damien Cito. Their current working idea now is to run an outdoor spectacular in April with the Mysterio Jr. vs. Misterioso Mask vs. Mask match and attempting to bring WCW talent in. Damien's son is now working Tijuana local shows as Galaxy Jr., using his father's WCW name, while Halloween's younger brother is working as Rocky Boy. Halloween's original wrestling name was Ricky Boy. AAA. The plan right now is to only run one Triple Mania, as opposed to doing 3 as in years past. The show is being talked about for the first week of May with no site selected, but I've heard Tampico and Mexico City both discussed. The expectation is that several major WWF wrestlers would come in for that show. Expect Sultan as the next WWF wrestler to arrive. There's no date or place finalized for a Bret Hart vs. Latin Lover match, other than it is expected to take place in April. With Hart booked in both South Africa and Kuwait in the early part of the month, it's going to be hard to find free dates for him. The winner of the Hart Latin Lover match is supposed to wrestle Pierroth Jr. at Triple Mania. Pero Arguello's retirement is expected within the next few months, and his final show would probably be the next major spectacular after Triple Mania. Arguello turned 51 in January. Razor Ramon and Diesel's appearance at the Juan de la Barrera Gym show on February 28 drew less than we had reported last time. We've heard estimates ranging from 2,500 to 3,900, but that it was closer to half full than full. However, Ramon and Diesel drew a sellout of 5,500 to the Auditorio in Tijuana on March 7 for a match against Cibernetico and Connect, with jacked-up ticket prices of 130 new pesos ringside, which is actually only about $16 American with the latest peso devaluation, but it's a ton of money for the locals. It was probably the largest live gate ever at the Auditorio, which is saying a mouthful since that building has a wrestling tradition going back as long as anyone can remember. Probably a bigger surprise than the crowd, which was super hot for the main event, was that the bout was reported as being close to 3.5 stars with super heat for the USA vs. Mexico stuff. Cibernetico is getting the big babyface push right now as they attempt to make him the next Conan and groom him to be Arguello's replacement in the top babyface slot, then probably giving him a big push in an upcoming Mask vs. Mask match against Pierroth Jr. Actually, I can see him losing that match since Conan got over the hottest originally after losing his mask to Arguello, and actually Cibernetico, who is like 22 years old, has a good look without the hood. My feeling is that throwing away that he's not a good worker because he's young enough that he can improve, but I've seen him live many times and he's got size and a body like Conan, but he doesn't have charisma. Anyway, apparently he looked great in Tijuana. A lot of the fans who bought tickets, in fact, probably most, thought that it was going to be Kevin Nash and Scott Hall and not Rick Bogner and Glenn Jacobs, and some fans when they saw Bogner and Jacobs thought they were Hall and Nash. The American stars mean something in the border cities because those fans can pick up U.S. television, but in the rest of Mexico, the WWF names don't mean anything until they come in and do something in Mexico. Also on that show, Octagon retained the national middleweight title, winning 2 out of 3 falls from Fuerza Guerrera, and in the best match of the show, Pantera and Supernova and Leon Negro beat Hysteria and Depredator and Espectro in a match which saw lots of great flying moves, including Nova doing the Takamichi Noku springboard moonsault to the floor. Blue Demon Jr. will be out of action for a few weeks and had to spend several days in the hospital as during an interpromotional type of match in Nuevo Laredo. Halloween blew fire at him and he got severe burns all over his chest because the fireball was too strong. All Japan. The March 2nd television show, which featured the Mitsuharu Misawa title defense against Steve Williams from the previous night, drew an amazing 5.0 rating in the 12:45 a.m. to 1:15 a.m. Sunday night time slot. I believe that's the best rating All Japan has done since it was moved to a purgatory time slot a few years back. It's hard to explain why All Japan's TV ratings have been through the roof the past few months, particularly for a promotion based so heavily on work rate, except that once again there is no correlation between TV ratings and arena business. The match was said to have been below the standard of their previous matches, but still a good match. The finish was actually the Tiger Driver 91, which is a double arm suplex which ends up in the person being dropped on his head, after 2 regular Tiger Drivers. The Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao vs. Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama match aired on March 9. There was a newspaper article on March 10 saying that Yuvi Sano, real name Naoki Sano, was trying to get into All Japan. The article said that Sano was expected to do 1 or 2 All Japan dates, but All Japan, as is its policy of announcing things when it is good and ready, failed to confirm the story. Sano did an interview building up the angle, saying that Takayama, the former UWFI wrestler who was on the March 1st show, was a relatively inexperienced pro wrestler going into the event, while he's an experienced UWFI wrestler in the pro style. Many years ago, Sano had a legendary series of matches with Jushin Liger for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. Giant Baba, Masao Inoue and Kenta Kobashi were in Taiwan this past week doing tryouts to bring a student or 2 back to Japan to train. There were 110 people trying out for the spot. New Japan. The new tour opened on March 5th in Niigata before a sellout 4,000 fans, with an angle in the main event which pitted the NWO trio of Masahiro Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito against the New Japan team of Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi and Keiji Muto. At the finish, Muto used a facebuster on Kojima and then Chono gave him a Yakuza kick for the pin. It appeared Muto would turn heel, they're doing the same Sting gimmick with him, and join the NWO, but when Chono tried to shake Muto's hand, Muto walked out on him, walked expressionless to the dressing room, and immediately took a taxi out of the building to his hotel room rather than go back with the rest of the wrestlers on the tour bus. Chono again said that they were going to get Muto to join the NWO, while Muto later said he simply made a mistake in the ring doing the move on Kojima and that he was sorry. They're building to 2 major matches with Chono against Muto, the second being against Muta, on both March 25th and April 12th, both in Tokyo. WCW wrestlers Steve Regal, Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit, and Faces of Fear were on the first week of this tour. Pegasus teamed with fellow Horsemen in Japan. The 4 Horsemen are Jushin Liger, Pegasus, El Samurai and Black Tiger aka Eddie Guerrero, although they're basically never together. Liger and Samurai to beat Koji Kanemoto and Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa. Faces of Fear and Regal joined forces to beat Shinya Hashimoto and Junji Hirata and Tadao Yasuda. On March 7th at Korakuen Hall after Muto's match, Chono came out with an NWO t-shirt and tried to get Muto to put it on, but Muto again refused. On March 8th in Tokuyama, which also sold out the 4,000-seat gym in Riki Choshu's hometown, Muto pinned Regal and Faces of Fear lost to Hashimoto and Sasaki, while Liger and Pegasus beat Otani and Takaiwa. They began an underneath feud involving Heisei Ishgun as Kengo Kimura, a former High member, teamed with Tatsumi Fujinami and Osamu Kido and Osamu Nishimura in an 8-man against High, which was basically to build heat for a March 20th title match in Nagoya, with Fujinami and Kimura defending against Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsutoshi Goto of High. Former New Japan wrestlers Kotetsu Yamamoto and Kantaro Hoshino were training Naoya Ogawa this week at the New Japan Dojo. Yamamoto, who sometimes serves as a referee and is more famous as a color commentator on television now, said that Ogawa is the same level as a fighter as Hashimoto, Muto, Nobuhiko Takada, and Akira Maeda. The February 22nd television show did a 4.0 rating, which may actually be even more amazing than the All Japan number on March 2nd because New Japan aired at 3 a.m. Other Japan notes. Weekly Pro Wrestling announced its 1996 Readership Awards, which are a shoot. The number of responses was way down compared with previous years. Keiji Muto was named Most Popular Wrestler of the Year with Masahiro Chono 2nd, Mitsuharu Misawa 3rd, Hayabusa 4th, and Kenta Kobashi 5th. For Most Popular Foreign Wrestler, Stan Hansen finished 1st for the 9th straight year, with Scott Norton 2nd, Steve Williams 3rd, Rick Steiner 4th, and The Patriot 5th. In Most Popular Women's Wrestler division, Megumi Kudo was first, followed by Manami Toyota, Shinobu Kandori, Kyoko Inoue, and Takako Inoue. They didn't do balloting for things like Match of the Year, Tag Match of the Year, Rookie of the Year, etc. as in past years, presumably because of what a nightmare it is to count all those ballots. Basically quiet this week when it comes to news from the other groups. Hiromi Yagi and Yuki Miyazaki of JWP both retired this past week. Yagi's retirement, since he's getting married later this year, was well known, and her final match had a big ceremony on March 9th at Korakuen Hall, which drew a sellout 2010, losing a JWP junior title match to Tomoko Kuzumi. Miyazaki, 18, a second-year pro, more quietly quit after a match on March 4th. One of the former major women's stars in Japan, Nobuko Bison Kimura, 29, of the JD promotion, officially announced at a press conference on March 6 that she would be retiring later this year, as was reported here last week. Kimura faces Linus Asuka on March 20th at Korakuen Hall for Asuka's TWF World title. The Big Japan Pro Wrestling promotion held a press conference also on March 6 to announce its April 1st Korakuen Hall show, headlined by an electric death match with Tarzan Goto and Mitsuhiro Matsunaga versus Seiji Yamakawa and Shoji Nakamaki. The big angle at the press conference is that Big Japan president Shinya Kojikawa was attacked by Takashi Ishikawa of the Ishikawa Ika promotion. The two promotions are feuding, and at the Ishikawa Group's debut show, Kojikawa jumped Ishikawa in the shower. The newly revived IWA was down to an estimated 250 fans for its second Korakuen Hall show on March 4th with a main event of Masao Orihara and Keisuke Yamada and Great Kabuki vs Hiromichi Fuyuki and Gedo and Jado. On the Michinoku Pro shows, the heel group of Dick Togo and men's Teo and Shiryu and Taka Michinoku along with the returning Hanzo Nakajima, who had been working in England for the past long time, all wear ECW-style BWO Japan t-shirts. I've never heard a gimmick in my life catch fire like this. It started in WCW and has spread to New Japan, ECW, Michinoku Pro, WWF TV and AAA. LLPW drew an estimated 1,400 to Korakuen Hall on March 8 with a 3 of 5 fall main event with Eagle Sawai teaming with Shark Tsuchiya, FMW and Asuka, JD, and Michiko Nagashima to beat Shinobu Kondori and Harley Saito and Norio Tadano and Michiko Omukai. USWA Billy Travis and Flash Flanagan beat Wolfie D and Jamie Dundee to win the USWA tag titles. I believe the title change took place on March 1st in Memphis. On the March 8th television show, the Truth Commission beat Travis and Flanagan in a non-title match due to outside interference, and Stephen Dunn made the save spraying a fire extinguisher on the commission. The Memphis show this week was March 12th with Jerry Lawler vs. King Reginald for the unified title, and if Lawler wins, he gets 5 minutes alone with Queen Nikki, plus Travis and Flanagan defend against Truth Commission with the losers leaving town for 90 days. Brian Christopher and Tony Williams vs. Wolfie and Jamie with a flagpole on a pole, and Mike Samples vs. Bobby Bolton as the top bouts. Elijah, Spellbinder, and Brackus have formed a tag team as well. The reason Doug Gilbert did the one television show and never returned is that Larry Burton insisted he work exclusively for this promotion and give up his indie dates, and he didn't like those terms. Super Hysteria, Jason Meyer, who had been working in prelims, quit the promotion. ECW The Improper Bostonian, billed as Boston's Guide to Entertainment and Culture, had an amazing 6-page feature on ECW in the February 26 through March 11 issue. The story, written by Betsy Sherman, was one of the best stories ever written on pro wrestling I've seen, in that the writer had a total understanding of the subject material, which is something you almost never see in a media story on pro wrestling. After the first 6 paragraphs, you knew this wasn't a writer who didn't have a clue about the real pro wrestling business, and in fact understood the real core of what pro wrestling is and isn't better than 99.5% of so-called smart fans and many self-professed wrestling experts. The difference between the level of understanding the business in this story and stories written by numerous writers who actually are somewhat insiders is amazing. The story wasn't written as a knock on wrestling per se. In fact, it was very much positive in a lot of ways in regard to ECW, but not to the point it wasn't a fair evaluation of both the good and bad side of the industry, written by someone who is clearly a major fan of the product but not blinded to or afraid of reality by being a fan, comparing the first ECW she saw live in Revere, Massachusetts as being a blissed out Woodstock, and the second, the show with the Eric Kulas incident, as its wake-up call Altamont. The story started out positive about the product, including a nice sidebar on local boys make good the Eliminators. But then the other side of reality hit with a description of the Kulas story. Sherman wrote, "Terrible things happen at auto races. Terrible things happen at rodeos. But it's hard to imagine at any other kind of event but an ECW show that a segment of the crowd would greet paramedics with the chant of boring and get the fat bastard out of the way. A clutch of guys a few rows behind me serenaded the exiting, stretcher-bound Kulas with na 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 na, hey hey, goodbye." Sherman had quotes from Paul Heyman about the Kulas incident, clearly in total disbelief of his side of the story, an ingenuousness that would make Oliver North jealous, and said Heyman caps his tail off with, "He sent word from the ambulance that, if available, he'd like to work the next show here." He also talked with Kulas and his father. Eric Kulas said, "You can't really call it blading. Blading is just a prick. And I've got a 6-inch slice that says it wasn't blading. I have a crack in my skull. I have permanent nerve damage in my head. You know the fork he was carrying on a noose? I have holes that they couldn't stitch, they were so small. So now I got craters all over my face. I feel that I hate Mr. Heyman for lying through his teeth. I hate New Jack for what he did to me, for what he did to my face, for what he did to my family. The hardest time of my life has been the holidays. Especially Thanksgiving. I would sit here and almost start crying, because I had so much to be thankful for, and my grandmother would start crying. I can't go over her house, because every time she sees me face she starts crying. I feel if they did anything else, I would have been raped. It was almost like getting crucified with 1,000 people watching. As of now, I hate wrestling. It ruined my life. And I advise anybody out there, never want to wrestle. It's a dirty sport. Stephen Kulas was quoted as saying, "They're claiming my son lied about his age, which he didn't. They used my son, and it wasn't for his ability. They used him as a patsy. They just wanted somebody big they could stab." The story said the Kulas have a copy of a videotape of the incident which they've shown to a lawyer they've hired to pursue litigation. She wrote that Heyman hasn't answered requests to discuss the Kulas situation any farther. Sherman's conclusion to both the story and the Kulas situation is, if ECW's fans are part of the problem, well, is it really realistic to ask wrestling fans to grow up? Once we succumb to the seduction, enter that dark corner of ambiguous violence that hardcore promises regression is necessary to enjoy the rush. But there's such a thing as becoming blindly complicit with the con. Sooner or later, we've got to turn the lights on, even in the house of hardcore. Only show of the past week was March 8th in Trenton, New Jersey, which drew a sellout 1,300 with another 500 or more turned away at the door. It was a sold show, and Paul Heyman wanted to run a second show that night at 11:20 p.m. so he could split another good gate and sell merchandise to those turned away, but the building wouldn't allow it. In fact, even though it was a sellout, the owner of the building, at least at this point, doesn't want ECW back, claiming it was too noisy outdoors before the show started. It was described to us that there were a lot of WWF fans at the show and a lot of kids, and the crowd was super hot, similar to the recent Scranton, Pennsylvania show. It was the first ECW show in New Jersey in something like 3 years. Return dates are May 2nd in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and May 3rd in Trenton, New Jersey, presumably at a different building. Taz beat Spike Dudley. After the match, Sabu went after Taz, but wound up leg-dropping Dudley through a table. The spot was screwed up as Dudley wound up with his teeth coming through his lip and needed 13 stitches. Eliminators kept the tag titles, beating Bad Crew in 97 seconds. Raven kept the ECW title, beating Supernova in 2:24. Pitbull number 2 no contest Brian Lee with a lot of run-ins. Chris Chetty beat Little Guido. This was the one ugly incident of the show. After seeing the stars early, seeing two guys they see as jobbers saw the crowd really get on both guys. Actually, Chetty, who has had only a few pro matches and was trained by Taz, shows a lot of potential, and Guido is a good worker, although he's really only like 165 pounds and because of that is really just a jobber with the FBI gimmick, and people see him as such. Anyway, they were chanting boring at both wrestlers, and when that didn't end the match, they began throwing things at the wrestlers, and fans came in with a lot of things to throw. Guido started throwing things back at the fans, which is never smart. One fan got hit with something Guido threw and got a bloody nose. ECW quickly gave him some free merchandise, and at that point 3 different fans got up and threw their chairs into the ring at Guido before things got back to normal. Well, abnormal. New Jack and Louis Spicolli beat Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney. There were lots of run-ins here, including one by Steve Williams, who the fans got on big time for his expanding waistline. Mustafa isn't booked some weekends since he's now living in Reno, Nevada. Tommy Dreamer beat Devon Dudley. After the match, when Joel Gertner was about to announce Devon as the winner, Ela KO'd him with a cane. Sandman beat Bubba Ray Dudley, and the main event saw Sabu pin Chris Condito in a high-flying match. Plans now are to start taping 1 hour of television every weekend rather than do most of the tapings at the arena, now that the other buildings are drawing as well as the arena and the crowd reactions have been hotter in the new locations. It also enables TV to be more updated, which is the direction the entire business is going. The house shows in late April and early May are going to be billed as barely legal, the aftermath running angles from the pay-per-view show. Expect Jerry Lawler to come in and work a program with Tommy Dreamer, here and there. Former Olympic gold medalist Kurt Angle apparently worked on an indie wrestling show in the Pittsburgh area on February 15th. Steve Nelson's USWF has its next show on April 12th at the Amarillo Fairgrounds Coliseum with a 19-match show. Nelson is advertising the show as no fakes, no fixes. It's real. Nelson's Shoot Wrestling promotion is the top drawing indie in the country right now. Greg Price's All-Star Wrestling drew 1,310 in Washington, North Carolina for a show which included the Rock and Roll Express, Bobby Fulton, Rob Van Dam, Billy Kidman, Greg Valentine, the Eagle and Giant Kimala II. Ultimate Championship Wrestling is going to open up a wrestling school in New York called the UCW Hart Brothers Wrestling Camp. They are looking at a May opening and are billing Bruce Hart, Jim Neidhart, and Chris Chavez, Tatanka, as the instructors. Manny Fernandez is now working as the head instructor at the Pacific Coast Sports Wrestling Camp in Hayward, California, and appearing on that group's indie shows as its champion. NHB. No major news, although the show reported on in last week's issue as being on March 3rd in Sao Paulo, Brazil, was actually held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Vernon White and Matt Rocca of Lion's Den will be competing in a UFC type of event held in Sydney, Australia on March 22nd, called the Australasian Ultimate Fighting Championship. Dan Severn is considering doing an indie UFC-style shoot show somewhere in Northern California in April. Severn was offered a front office job as a spokesperson for UFC. They wanted him to retire and they would retire his t-shirt, making him the first fighter whose uniform would be retired in the history of the promotion. However, Severn is opposed to retiring with a loss to Mark Coleman as his final match and wants to be back on the July pay-per-view show, which will be from Tokyo. Severn reportedly told Bob Merowitz that if there was legitimate steroid testing in UFC, that he would still beat everyone they have now who was clean. Severn has long been an advocate of a level playing field in UFC even when he was dominating. WCW. Monday Nitro was held March 10th in Panama City outdoors at Club La Vela with a ring in a swimming pool before approximately 2,000 fans there, largely out-of-towners for spring break. They really weren't wrestling fans, but reacted to seeing the stars live. The atmosphere at the beginning of the show made WCW seem really like an thing, but as the crowd hardly reacted to the wrestling, it ended up turning into a flat show by the finish. The only real major storyline on the show was Roddy Piper doing an interview, obviously majorly pissed off at the reaction to his Ultimate Ego angle of the previous week and to the WWF commentary during the Owen Hart-Davey Boy Smith match. He did agree to acquiesce as far as his teammates on the pay-per-view goes. It was never made clear, but my belief is that Piper's team will be composed of himself, John Tenta, Steve McMichael and Jeff Jarrett, with Flair, Anderson, Leighton Morse or Morrison, and Craig Malley all in the corners, presumably based on the interview, which sounds just a slight bit crowded. Ric Flair and Arnold Anderson came out as Piper was ranting and raving, and Anderson said it was a job for professionals, not amateurs, and Flair, who got the biggest reaction of anyone on the show as it was a primarily early 20s male audience, started dancing around. Finally, after turning them down a few times, Piper agreed to take the Horsemen as his partners. Let's see if I can explain the main event, since almost nobody seems to be able to remember the steps. If the NWO team wins, then the NWO gets to appear on all WCW television shows. If the NWO team loses, then the NWO members must leave WCW for 3 years, like there's a chance that'll happen, and the WCW singles and tag titles will be returned to the WCW Championship Committee. If Piper's team wins, then Piper gets a cage match with Hogan. Also added to the pay-per-view show is Ultimo Dragon vs. Psicosis, if Psicosis can get across the border, as he was supposed to be on Nitro and still wasn't there, and Public Enemy vs. Harlem Heat, with Heat replacing McMichael and Jarrett, who move up to the main event. Piper's interview largely made no sense as usual, first knocking Howard Stern. Don't know if Stern said something about Piper on March 10th when Hogan and Rodman were on his show, then got mad at the WWF, mentioning them by name but not Jim Ross by name. During the Hart-Smith match the previous week, Ross was knocking WCW, calling them the Seniors Tour, the over 40 promotion, and mentioned that he didn't believe there were any wrestlers in the WWF with one hip. Piper called the WWF liars, saying that when he was there last year and beat Goldust, that he only had one hip then. He then ripped on his critics, and boy were there many, for knocking his friends, saying he'd never turn his back on his friends and be a fair-weather friend because people said bad things about them, which was ironic since the whole idea of the interview segment was for him to eventually drop them from the match. Piper also said that the WWF was right about being no one-hip wrestlers in the WWF, saying that there isn't one hip wrestler in the entire WWF, and that's why everyone watches WCW pay-per-views and not WWFs. Ironically, the two sides are still pretty much equal on pay-per-view. It's Monday Night TV ratings where WCW has the big edge. Nitro saw Jarrett and McMichael over High Voltage in 4:42, beating David Taylor in 2:46. NWO came to the building, but the mystery man, Page in the Shadows, jumped Mr. Wall Street, who was laid out. Eddie Guerrero kept the U.S. belt, beating Jim Powers by ramming Powers into Teddy Long in 2:50. They are trying to give Guerrero that dreaded edge since he's no longer over, and the feeling is that kind of babyface doesn't get over nowadays. Diamond Dallas Page pinned Craig Pittman with the Diamond Cutter in 4:19 in a really bad match. Crowd pretty much was dead for the rest of the show after a short power failure during Page's interview. Rey Mysterio Jr. pinned Galaxy in 2:21 of a match below par for both. Lex Luger and the Giant and Steiners beat Amazing French Canadians and Greg Valentine and Roadblock in 2:01. Ultimo Dragon pinned Juventud Guerrera in 4:52 with a Tiger Suplex. The crowd was totally dead for these guys, and they were sloppier than expected, The floating ring probably affected balance, and the style these guys use involves more balance than other styles, but it was still the best match on the show. Scotty Riggs beat Chris Jericho via DQ in 3:33 when Marcus Bagwell came in with a belt and began whipping Riggs. Jericho saved Riggs. Medusa did an interview. Interesting to note that the largely early 20s male crowd didn't pop at all for Medusa. Kevin Sullivan double count out Hardbody Harrison, which saw Sullivan throw him all over the club, down the stairs to the beach, and finally Harrison was the guy who, thanks to Sullivan and Jacqueline, took the bump into the swimming pool. Since they were guaranteed one swimming pool bump on the show, you'd think they could find a better flunky than that. NWO did an interview with Sting coming out with them. Hogan gave Sting an NWO t-shirt, but he just stood there with a mime face and didn't take the shirt. Show went off the air with Public Enemy brawling with Heat. For March 10th, WCW's Nitro did a 3.51 rating and 5.55 share as compared with Raw doing a 2.34 rating and 3.60 share. Nitro Replay did a 1.5 rating and 3.8 share. Even though the Raw show had more energy and was overall the better show, once again it was Nitro that saw the audience grow throughout, and Raw largely stayed flat and even slightly dipped as the show went on. The most telling tale is that WCW grew from a 3.2 first hour to a 3.8 seconds hour, while WWF fell from 2.4 to 2.3 despite throwing trick after trick out there, including reformatting Raw to where it was more like Nitro with the fast squash matches and lots of interviews and angles. It's the superior star power as opposed to superior program quality. Raw's peak came during the third quarter, Ahmed Johnson squash, Nation of Domination and Road Warriors confrontation, with a 2.7 going against WCW's 3.5 for squash matches with Guerrero and Page. WCW's peak was the final quarter-hour NWO interview, including the clip of Rodman, with a 3.9 to 2.3 edge, and of Heyman Lawler debate and beginning of Sid and Undertaker tag match. The Sid and Taker vs. Vader and Mankind tag match after 10 p.m. going unopposed only rose to a 2.5 rating. In regard to Ken Shamrock and a Chris Shamrock interview, largely Steve Austin talking, did a 2.4, basically the show average, while WCW did a strong 3.7 for the 8-man with Luger and Giant and Steiners. The end of the Shamrock segment, which was really the lengthy Bret Hart diatribe plus Austin at the end and a Billy Gunn squash, drew a 2.2, while WCW dropped to a 3.5 for Dragon vs. Guerrera. When WCW had the Sullivan and Jacqueline show going against WWF's Great Debate with ECW, it was a 3.8 to 2.2 edge, the largest gap at any point. The other segment with ECW was the closest gap in the ratings, the Hart and Smith vs. Blackjacks with Taz and Lawler challenges confrontation, and Sabu going through the table did a 2.6, while WCW did a 3.3 for Page interview take 2 and Rey Mysterio Jr., although WCW was coming off a power failure and lengthy commercials to cover that power failure up, and that meant a lot more in the ratings than what was on either show during that period. The important opening segment with WWF doing an angle with Sid, Undertaker, Vader and Mankind did a 2.0, while WCW opened with the Horseman squash and the Piper interview with the Horseman at a 3.2. Other WCW weekend ratings saw Main Event at 1.2, Saturday Night at 2.7 and Pro at 1.2. Disco Inferno, Glenn Gilberti, was fired on March 4th when he refused to do a program which would have ended with him putting over Jacqueline in the single match at Uncensored. The vast majority of the wrestlers were totally in support of Disco on that one and felt that putting over a woman in a singles match was a career killer. TV ratings on March 4th in Rome, Georgia drew about 2,500, 2,000 paying $19,000. Randy Anderson, who along with Arnold Anderson, no relation although the two have been friends going back to their high school days more than 20 years ago, are both from Rome, Georgia originally, was given the key to the city and the mayor called him Pee Wee Herman instead of Anderson. Mortis Chris Kluseritis, aka Chris Kenyon, debuted under the management of Jimmy Vandenberg, who used to work as Daryl Van Horn in SMW. After seeing Mortis, we now know why La Parka isn't allowed to use his Mexican gimmick in the States. Parka was told it wouldn't get over, but actually they had already copied the Parka look for their own creation, and then when they brought Parka in, they had to tone down his costume. The show that aired on March 8th was a throwaway, although Prince Aokia beat Super Kalo in a very good high-flying match for the TV title. Not much more on March 15th. Dean Malenko was DQ'd for choking Bobby Eaton. Aokia pinned Juventud Guerrera. A guy named Mike Whitney got a tryout, and the best match of the show, taped for the main event show, was an abbreviated Lucha Trios match with Conan and La Parka and Villano 4 over Guerrera and Galaxy and Chavo Guerrero Jr. Public Enemy has signed a new 2-year contract. Brian Clark, formerly Night Stalker and later Atom Bomb, has signed and should be starting shortly. Reggie Bennett, whose most recent work was with All Japan Women through mid-December, was at Super Brawl in San Francisco looking for work. She'd be a hell of a lot better than what they're putting in the ring at this point as far as women wrestlers. A correction from last week. The deal in the Playboy with Kimberly Falkenberg does have frontal nudity. At the American Film Market 97, which is going on this week, only 2 movies with wrestlers were screened. Bad Pack, a Magnificent Seven knockoff, stars Roddy Piper along with bodybuilder Ralph Muller and is said to be no good. Shocker. The other was Hogan Santa with Muscles, whose first screening attracted all of 7 people and whose second screening attracted 0. The advance for the March 31st Nitro in Roanoke, Virginia has topped $67,000. Spring Stampede in Tupelo, Mississippi on April 6th did a $30,000 first day, actually only 1,200 tickets, and the Nitro on April 7th in Huntsville, Alabama did an amazing $41,000 first day. With 1 week to go, Uncensored on March 16th in North Charleston, South Carolina had sold 3,800 tickets for $62,000. According to an article in Sports Collectors Digest, Paige Falkenberg said that his father nicknamed him Dallas when he was 7 years old because he was such a big Cowboys fan. That same issue has a lengthy article about Ted Irvine, the former NHL player who played from 1963 to 1977, with some notes in the story about his son, Chris Jericho. The March 3rd St. Paul Pioneer Press ran an update about the situation involving Hulk Hogan's lawsuit and countersuit involving an alleged sexual encounter after the first Nitro on September 4, 1995. The woman involved, Kate Kennedy, claims she helped Hogan sell his merchandise at the Nitro at the Mall of America, and when she delivered merchandise to his hotel room, Hogan forced her to have oral sex with him. Hogan claimed the story was false and as a preemptive strike against a lawsuit, sued her for extortion. Kennedy's attorneys are now filing a countersuit against Terry Bollea. In the suit, Kennedy says she arrived at Hogan's room after midnight to deliver merchandise, at which point Hogan lifted her off the floor and carried her to his bed where he forced her to perform oral sex. Eric Bischoff and Randy Savage are on the Jeff Foxworthy Show, which was taped on March 11th. Last we've heard is that Arnold Anderson is expected to be out for about 4 months and may undergo surgery to fuse 3 vertebrae in his neck. The neck injury, which is apparently a flaring up of an injury 7 years ago caused in a match against the Steiners, has caused his hand to go numb. Ted Turner wasn't at the March 3rd Nitro in Atlanta because 1, an office assistant died and he was attending her funeral, 2, he was out of town on business and canceled at the last minute, or 3, he didn't want to do it and sent Harvey Schiller in his place. They are keeping the possibilities of doing something with Turner alive in the storyline. Latest Jerry McDevitt quotes on Mark Madden. McDevitt said that Madden is to journalism what Heidi Fleiss is to dating and said, "What does it have to do with journalism when you are deliberately lying in regard to Madden using the Pennsylvania Reports Shield law to protect his sources in the WWF lawsuit against WCW?" Bischoff did a lengthy Prodigy chat on March 8th, mainly to talk about the Rodman deal. The Rodman deal got discussed, and other subjects heavily discussed were the proposed New Japan buyout. It should be noted that this is not even being discussed in Japan, and if the Japanese media thought it was a serious story, the idea their top promotion was getting bought out, it would be incredibly huge news. And Bischoff surprisingly saying the ECW alliance was the best move WWF had made over the last 12 months. Bischoff has Japan trips scheduled for late March, for the New Japan 25th anniversary party, and April, apparently to attend a GIA women's wrestling show. He also said that he hoped Piper would agree to allow them to change the main event but admitted it was up to Piper. He did his usual McMahon knocks. Overall, he did his usual switching between shooting and working, and when the lines are blurred like that it's hard to take anything seriously, although the questions and answers were better for this than previous sessions, and it seemed he was doing less working than in the past. WWF. Despite the apparent gloom and doom from the Monday night ratings, business was great this weekend. Headlined by Sid vs. Bret Hart cage matches, the weekend saw them do $8,338 and $153,429 on March 7th in Buffalo, New York, $6,585 and $116,787 for an afternoon show on March 8th at the Gund Arena in Cleveland, a near sellout $9,565 and $153,622 at Cobo Arena in Detroit for the evening show on March 8th, and $4,088 and $48,149 on March 9th in Springfield, Massachusetts. In addition, the March 10th Monday Night Raw from Worcester, Massachusetts drew 7,481 fans with a new Raw record with a $115,271 house. As mentioned previously, Raw was more like Nitro, lots of angles, lots of interviews, lots of fast squashes. The show opened with Sid saying he wasn't going to team with Undertaker. Undertaker came out and said he was the one who had the most to lose because if something happened to Sid, it would be Undertaker who would be out the title shot. And if something happened to Undertaker, Sid would keep the title. Vader and Mankind attacked and in the brawl, Vader hit Undertaker, who turned around and thought it was Sid. I think we've seen that one too many times before and far too recently. Sid/Michaels angle in November. Rocky Maivia beat Tony Roy in 58. Sultan jumped Rocky after but Rocky cleaned house and decked Bob Backlund as well. Tony Atlas was in the crowd and Rocky hugged him and brought him out of the crowd. The impression was given Atlas would be in Maivia's corner to counteract Backlund and Iron Sheik. Pentagon and Heavy Metal and Pierre Roth Jr. beat Hector Garza and Latin Lover in Octagon in 10-13 when Metal pinned Latin with La Magistral. This was reminiscent of the early days of Mexicans on WCW. The announcers not knowing what was going on, the obvious Octagon-Pentagon deal wasn't known by the announcers, and the segment was largely meant as backdrop for an angle where security kicked the Amazon woman out. They did a 5-dive spot, climaxing with Garza doing the corkscrew plancha which popped the crowd. Crowd really wasn't into the wrestlers but it was the best match of the night on either show. Ahmed Johnson squashed Roy Raymond in 201. Nation of Domination came out for a confrontation and Road Warriors came out of the crowd. This segment got a huge crowd reaction. Blackjacks beat Hart and Smith via DQ in 1041. Teams didn't work together well at all. Just a bad match. Taz did an interview threatening Lawler. Lawler kept insulting him. Taz came out and they choked each other until Sabu did a springboard off the chair and the ropes but both guys moved and Sabu went through a table. Cameras didn't catch the dive well. Miguel Perez pinned Leif Cassidy in 410. Perez didn't look as good as he usually does. Shamrock was brought out to a good but not overwhelming pop. Austin was on the video wall running him down. Shamrock challenged Austin to come in the ring but Bret Hart came down instead. Hart did a long interview complaining about everything, mainly to Hype Mania, although on the March 17th live Raw, they've got a cage match with Bret vs. Sid for the title. In fact, TV made it appear they were going to switch the title again next week and the Bret Austin submission match at Mania would end up as the title match. After all the complaints, Shamrock said that he wasn't a marriage counselor. Austin came out and flipped both guys off and left. Honky Tonk Man came out and got a big babyface pop until he insulted the fans in Worcester and they booed him, still looking to manage someone. Billy Gunn, looking noticeably more muscular, and he's not the only one of late, pinned Aldo Montoya in 249. Not good, although Gunn has some heel charisma. They totally dropped the neck injury angle and comeback that they had spent months building. And Jim Ross and Vince McMahon are friends again. Mankind did an interview throwing down the urn and punching himself in the head until he bled. Yes, blood is back. Goldust squashed Tim McDeany in 138, after which Helmsley and Joni attacked Goldust. Marlena jumped on Joni until she was pulled off. Joni then threw around a few refs and even press slammed downtown Bruno. The debate was great with Heyman and Lawler, at least for Heyman's insider audience. Heyman, billed as Paul E. Dangerously, was the total face and Lawler was awesome running down ECW at getting WWF fans into it. Heyman asked Lawler how the action was by the seesaw in Louisville, in reference to the statutory rape case against Lawler with a 13-year-old that was later dropped in 1993. Lawler brought up Heyman's father funding the company and without it they'd be out of business. Sandman smashed a beer can on his head and bled and threw the beer on Lawler. Dreamer challenged Lawler. Lawler called for his friends to come out but none did, and he finally left. It may be too inside for some fans but it appeared heated. Finally Vader and Mankind beat Sid and Undertaker in 10:33. The show went about 10 minutes long. Match was real bad. Mankind was working with a severe back injury although he still did that clothesline bump and landed with his back on the ring steps that couldn't have helped him much. Sid was huge and awful. Undertaker and Sid turned on each other. Taker choke slammed Sid, but Sid kicked out of the pin. Undertaker did an amazing running plancha outside the ring making him the largest man probably in the history of wrestling ever to try such a dive. Sid attacked Taker and power bombed him and Vader pinned Taker. Taker cleaned house on Vader after the match. The bout did tell its story and the dive was great, but it was a bad match. At the weekend house shows, Sid beat Bret in all the cage matches when both were escaping simultaneously. Sid through the door, Bret climbing over, but Sid touched first. Farouk over Undertaker by DQ. Vader pinned Johnson. Goldust beat Mankind. Maivia beat Sultan and Owen and Bulldog over LaFon and Furnace. Can you believe that just 18 months ago, WCW had Steve Austin put Renegade over on television not once but twice. Raw had a new graphics, a giant video wall, with the new opening shot in a rundown area in Brooklyn, and is now called Raw is War with all new theme music. Expect a feature on Sunny soon in People magazine. Wonder if and how it'll mention Chris Condito. The May 11th In Your House pay-per-view has been moved from Baltimore to Richmond, Virginia. Next Madison Square Garden show is May 17th. They are doing a fashion show with the wrestlers and valets in Chicago on March 22nd. It's going to be one major week with the Slammies live on Friday night, Mania on Sunday afternoon, live Raw on Monday and a Raw taping on Tuesday. Shotgun Saturday night and Superstars aren't going to feature the same matches. Shotgun appears to be the show being prioritized, adding Brian Pillman on color and Sonny doing a gossip segment. No word on what Superstars will become, but the 1 hour of taping after Raw every week will be Shotgun, and no longer Superstars. They are hopeful for Pillman to be back in the ring in 6 weeks. The tour of India fell through, so the Raw show on April 7th that was to be taped there will be taped on April 6th on an added show in La Crosse. Why? The April 14th Raw will be taped on April 9th in Johannesburg, South Africa at the stadium. Only half the crew will be on the April 7th and April 14th Raws, as the other half will be halfway around the world. The post-WrestleMania tours are March 30th to April 10th in South Africa and April 8th to April 14th in Kuwait. WrestleMania still has 3,000 to 4,000 tickets left at press time. WWF is working very hard on television upgrades in Europe. Sky TV will be doing the 2-hour Raws on the following Friday nights, and will now carry all the pay-per-view shows live. The winner of the 4-team tag match at Mania will get a tag title shot. Expect a major deal on June 9th since WWF will tape Raw in Hartford, Connecticut while WCW tapes Nitro in Boston the same night. Weekend numbers were Blast Off at 0.6, Livewire at 1.0 and Superstars at 1.5. There was a story in the Rochester, New York newspaper on March 9th regarding Flash Funk speaking to elementary school students in Rochester to stay in school and say no to drugs, and a promotion for the April 20th pay-per-view show which will be from Rochester. The reporter wrote that Funk has 230 to 250 bouts a year, winning and losing as the script dictates. I'm sure many would find more than a little irony over the choice of Charles Skaggs to give kids that message, considering his WCW tenure terminated over failures of several drug tests, and his WWF tenure began at about the time the company largely dropped testing. The February 26th Berlin show that aired on March 3rd on Raw also aired on tape delay later that evening throughout Europe on Sky Sports with Vince McMahon and Honky Tonk Man doing commentary. The Raw commentary was an updated version done live in the studios. In the version in Germany, there was a post-match interview where Owen Hart said he lost because the ref was prejudiced, and Bulldog said that the only reason Owen made it to the finals is because he helped Owen beat Brett in the tournament because of his interference. The latest expectation is that Shawn Michaels will return perhaps as early as May. The readers' pages. Schiavone. A few weeks ago on an episode of WCW Worldwide, my deepest suspicions were finally confirmed. Tony Schiavone has been forced to work as a circus ringmaster for so long, babysitting Virgil and all, that his brains have finally turned to pudding. During a Dean Malenko mock, Tony started reminiscing about the days when Boris Malenko managed the Masked Superstar in Jim Crockett Promotions. He talked about when Malenko would light up a cigar and stick it in someone's eye, Mighty Igor Angle in 1976. I thought it was great. Schiavone is finally putting over a current wrestler and at the same time paying tribute to a legend of the past. But then things fell completely apart. Bobby Heenan mentioned that he also managed the Masked Superstar, and then said that Dean Malenko was a great wrestler because he was trained by two wrestling legends, Boris Malenko and Karl Gotch. Well, Tony completely lost it. He called Heenan an idiot and said, yeah, maybe he was trained by the ghost of Karl Gotch. He's been dead since 1905. He wasn't trained by Karl Gotch. You're a moron. Where'd you get that one from? The internet? Those people are idiots, too. They just make that stuff up. Karl Gotch. Geez. Schiavone actually thought Karl Gotch was the wrestler who held the world title at the start of the century. He also thinks a shooting star press is called a Northern Lights press and thinks it was Mike Tenay who came up with the term Inzudri. I used to think Schiavone was a pretty decent announcer, but now he's just an embarrassment. I realize things get hectic in a company where the booking committee is staffed with paranoid sociopaths and the boss is a cross between John Davidson and Pauly Shore, but that's no excuse to not take enough pride in your profession that you come across as a complete bonehead to a national audience. Maybe when they add the new show on TBS and Tony and Dusty get 2 more hours of announcing tacked onto their schedule, they can fight about how stupid it was to call Rhodes' finisher the bionic elbow. Maybe someday the two of them would figure out that fat tub of lard would have never gotten over half as much had Gordon Soley not spent hour after hour telling the marks how great he was instead of spending the entire broadcast arguing with a has-been clown about his wife's cooking. I never thought I'd miss David Crockett as an announcer, but I do. Michael Lozier. Charlotte, North Carolina. Response from Dave Meltzer. But at least Schiavone knew it was Roberto Alomar and not Sandy Alomar who spit in the umpire's face. Raw vs. Nitro. Despite the fact I'm not a WWF fan, due to what Vince McMahon did to the AWA in the early 80s, I must pay the devil his due and say that the February 17th Monday Night Raw show was among the finest live TV shows I've ever seen. It appears McMahon's creative juices are finally starting to flow again, especially with the alliance with ECW. The ball is now in Eric Bischoff's court to see what he can come up with since the NWO is getting extremely old. A suggestion for future awards. Most ridiculous names for wrestlers such as non-current wrestler Porky the Pig, Mike Loren, Chic Detroit Promotion, current wrestler Trailer Park Trash, USWA, non-current tag team Fat Boys, Meat and Potatoes, USWA, Marty Ming and Artie Ing, Chic Detroit, current tag team Pinky Petunia and Red Rose, independent, Robert Sundloff Jr., Aurora, Illinois. I'm not surprised about the ECW/WWF angle being revived, but I am surprised at how they are putting ECW over as the babyfaces. I realize it's just Jerry Lawler, but I never thought I'd be alive to witness another company's wrestlers being put over WWF talent on their own television show. Desperate times for the WWF, I guess. Speaking of Lawler, man, he must be disillusioned. USWA is going into the toilet and he's the guy that every stiff non-wrestler with an ounce of celebrity value from William Shatner to Mark Henry goes over on. Judging from his shoot tantrum on ECW, he seems to be none too happy about being job fodder for a company he sounds like he really doesn't like. I don't feel sorry for him. The 90s have proven Jerry Lawler to be one of the biggest hypocrites ever in the business. Matt Creamer. Green Bay, Wisconsin. Great reporting on the recent Monday ratings. Thanks for the quarter-hour analysis. In my opinion, nothing is going to pull Raw past Nitro. Paul Heyman must have had a huge smile on his face when he hit the sack on February 24th, and he must still be smiling after seeing confirmation in the ratings. ECW TV is doing a far better job of building up their pay-per-view than I ever expected. Went to the Omni on March 3rd with a group of 12. We all had a great time. As you said in your comments about Super Brawl, WCW as a whole is over. Thunderous pop for Roddy Piper. As big as for Dusty Rhodes in his heyday. Diamond Dallas Page shirts everywhere. Even Scotty Riggs got a decent pop. John Drake. Athens, Georgia. Nitro is really getting lame. For the first time on March 3rd, I switched to Raw while the NWO was in the ring. The hot crowds make the show watchable, but they need some substance for me to keep interested. They are burning me out on all the BS 3-minute matches with endless screw job endings and run-ins and poor main events with the NWO. The thing with Sting is real old. My main complaint is the constant scamming to keep us tuned. The Hogan Giant/Robin Hood fiasco still hurts. An earlier letter said it all. Why scam your most loyal viewers? Give us a good product and we'll tune in. Give us a compelling 2-hour show and we'll give you good ratings. The February 24th Raw was at least entertaining. The ECW angle wasn't great, but at least it was different and I look forward to more from them. That was good TV. The return of the Road Warriors was fun. Ken Shamrock being on Raw had me glued to the set. If it wasn't for the Mexicans, Dean Malenko, Ultimo Dragon, Chris Benoit, and Dallas Page, I wouldn't even watch Nitro. They've really screwed up the NWO as far as I'm concerned. The fact I switched the channel now says it all. Page is fun to watch. He's the Michael Hayes of the 90s, personality, charisma, and a hot finishing move got him over. Bischoff didn't. However, is the NWO if the guys wearing NWO t-shirts cheer for Page? I think fans like the idea of the NWO, but not the execution of it. God help us if Bischoff gets any control of New Japan. Actually, I'd pay to see the reaction of the crowd to all the screw job endings. Paul Nucci. Ypsilanti, Michigan. What was Piper on during that recruiting angle on Nitro? Not only did he look inept being pummeled and tossed around by a bunch of nobodies and rejects, but he also cheapened the entire WCW talent crew. A total embarrassing waste. John Bamberger. San Anselmo, California. Michaels vs. Hart. I'm writing to respond to the letter by Dan Cirquitella in the February 3rd issue regarding Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. In his own way, Hart is every bit as good a worker as Michaels. Anyone who doesn't see it is unaware of their own ignorance. Does anyone say Dean Malenko isn't as good a worker as Chris Benoit or Eddie Guerrero because he doesn't perform as many high spots? As for comparing their performances against the same opponents, many other factors besides work rate, such as atmosphere, injury, significance of the event, clash of styles can dictate performance in a match. Cirquitella failed to mention both men have also wrestled Curt Hennig, Davey Boy Smith, and Owen Hart. Bret's matches with Razor Ramon were no more forgettable than Shawn's matches with Smith. Bret's matches with Diesel were no more cures for insomnia than Shawn's matches with Hennig. While I agree that Bret pouted a little too much when he had to drop the title, he certainly handled it a hell of a lot more professionally than Michaels. Rick Gillespie. Lymph Gamero